Hello, everyone. My name is Jason Holtzman. I am a 2022 IPF Atid delegate from Philadelphia, currently serving as the Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council, JCRC, of the Jewish Federation of Greater Philadelphia. I am so excited to be here today for the second event in our Critical Neighbors Summer Series, the Israeli-Palestinian Relationship. For those of you who are new to our community, welcome. IPF Atid is the Young Professionals Network of Israel Policy Forum, an organization dedicated to advancing support for a viable two-state solution that safeguards Israeli security. It is a community comprised of young professionals working to promote a more pragmatic, nuanced discourse around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As Israel continues to broaden its ties in the wider Arab world through the Abraham Accords, its relations with its immediate neighbors, Jordan, Egypt, and the Palestinian Authority, continue to be of great strategic importance, particularly with regard to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Israel Policy Forum launched its Critical Neighbors Task Force this year to continue exploring Israel's relations with Jordan, Egypt, and the PA, offering fresh insight on Israeli-Palestinian issues from regional perspectives. IPF Atid is excited to host our Critical Neighbors Summer Series, featuring a new member of the Critical Neighbors Task Force and highlighting a new regional relationship during each event. We are honored to be joined today by the Honorable Ibrahim Eid Dalalsha, our task force member from Palestine, who will speak to us about the Palestinian-Israeli relationship. To read a little bit of Ibrahim's bio, Ibrahim is a senior political consultant based in the West Bank. Currently, he heads a private think tank in Ramallah, the Horizon Center for Political Studies and Media Outreach. Mr. Dalalsha's former role as a senior political advisor at the U.S. Consulate General in Jerusalem spanned 2 decades. He has been named the State Department's Foreign Service National of the Year for outstanding political analysis, reporting, and extraordinary networking outreach 3 times throughout his career. Dalalsha has played an integral role in peace negotiations across the Middle East, including the 2014 ceasefire negotiations held in Cairo, in addition to other initiatives in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. We are so lucky to have Ibrahim with us today. All right, let's dive into some questions. Ibrahim, I want to talk to you because over the past few months, we've seen Israel step up anti-terror in Area A and an uptick in West Bank clashes between Israeli forces and Palestinian militants, along with the weakening Palestinian Authority and increasingly absent Palestinian Authority forces, particularly in the northern West Bank. What impact do you see this as having on the status quo in the West Bank and on Palestinian society? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks. Yeah, actually, the situation has really deteriorated in the past weeks and months. I don't really think it's unprecedented. I don't really think that this security situation and the tensions we have seen in the past few weeks and months have not actually happened before. Mind you, like in 2015, a few years back, there was another uptick in violence. I think what is different today and is really worrying is the fact that the Palestinian-Israeli Security Coordination, which has been resumed after the end of Second Intifada as of the year 2005 and 6, specifically under the Bush administration at the time, with the Israeli government, President Abbas, headed by Ehud Olmert at the time, President Abbas assuming office as a president. Many of those channels were reconstructed, and actually were strengthened. Palestinian security forces were trained and rebuilt, and although we didn't really have a political solution to the conflict throughout, those, past 15 or 17 years, at least we had solid, mechanisms of security coordination that, despite the political impasse, managed to keep the Israeli-Palestinian relations as such on a good track, waiting for, a conducive environment to resume negotiations. The problem that we have today is that there has been a weakening in the system itself, in the Palestinian Authority system, to the point that you have public articulations or statements by senior Israeli officials, including the defense minister, who points out to the weakness of the Palestinian Authority, basically refraining from acting against militants in the West Bank, particularly up in the north. The problem is, has even worsened today as we're holding this today, but there were incidents and clashes today between Palestinians and local Palestinian security forces and local youth after the PA arrested one Hamas militant or gunman in the city of Nablus. And until this minute, there are tensions and there are clashes with ups and downs. Essentially, I think the problem that we see today is that it's a manifestation, the weakness of the Palestinian Authority security forces and their active role, especially in the northern areas, has been weakened by many factors. I mean, like the forces physically are there. The problem is that there is weakness in the system attributed to several factors. We have a problem within the security establishment that has to do with morale. We have economic problems and financial problems that are impacting the Palestinian Authority. We have partial salaries that are being paid. We have extremely unpopular, if you will, Palestinian Authority, whether it is because of lack of progress and advancement in a peace track, or because of internal perceptions of corruption, or or otherwise. We can sort of like debate why it is unpopular. But we had elections that were cancelled last year. There is disgruntlement within the ruling party, Fatah. There are so many problems there. And the end result is that you have a Palestinian Authority that is very worried, very concerned about confronting militants, and then actually leading to a clash with wider segments of the Palestinian population, including youth. And this is exactly what's happening in Nablus. The problem started with arresting one militant, but then it spread to clashes with local youth who basically support, do not basically see the Palestinian Authority as a legitimate representative. So all these problems together have brought us to a situation where the Palestinian Authority is unable to maintain and implement the security doctrine that it had in the past, which is as simple as said, keep calm and coordination with the Israeli security forces, despite the political impasse pending a resumption of peace talks. Today, the Palestinian Authority is not in a position to actually deliver the same, or implement or enforce the same, and that is actually causing lots of problems. If we were to look ahead, I think there are many things that need to happen for the Palestinian Authority to actually re-exercise the same role that it did in the past. And I don't really, I want to, say something which is, I don't, what we have been witnessing in the past few months and weeks is not really, born in the past few weeks. This is a problem or months. This is a problem that has been accumulating, reaching to a level of, a point of boiling, where you actually see the splashes basically of this boiling out of the container, if you will. There are so many different solutions that will have to be enforced at the end. This situation, even if it goes to an eruption of violence, there has to be a track to take it back where it should be. And I think I'm convinced actually that the Palestinian Authority is not changing its course. It's not changing its doctrine. It's essentially, in a very difficult spot at all levels, including, as I said, like political, economic, financial, and internal problems that have weakened the system as such.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. It's already, a lot for us to think about and consider that you have started off with.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what do you think Israel and the PA should do in order to prevent a serious deterioration in the security situation in the West Bank?
I think, frankly, as I said, I think, the security coordination is essentially, it's not just an Israeli interest. I think it's also a Palestinian interest. And I think, please don't get from what I said that the security coordination collapsed. The security coordination did not collapse. I think it's just has been in a crisis in the past few weeks and months. And, the solid foundations upon which the security coordination was built over, more than a decade and a half continue to exist, but they are being tested against challenges, against internal challenges that the PA is suffering from, and as such, its performance on law and order within the Palestinian territories is becoming again, less than satisfying. And obviously, this when reflects on Israeli security, then, this leads to tensions that the PA, I think, is not opting for, but is basically facing, and the choices are, they either let this go and deteriorate further, or clash, or carry out a crackdown to enforce, law and order, and that would come at a cost domestically, and this is why I think that there is lots of reluctance. At the end of the day, I think, the Palestinian Authority also has political grievances, has political demands. They look at a different Israeli government or coalition in Israel that could push, and pursue a political track in a way that could also bring about concrete and tangible achievements, deliverables to the Palestinian people, where it can claim legitimacy on the basis of having brought those deliverables to the Palestinian people. It's a situation where the PA is feeling cornered and isolated and unable to deliver on the Palestinian aspiration of pursuit of end of occupation, which is one of the key justifications, basically, of the Palestinian Authority's existence and key functions, which has not happened. And regardless of who's to blame now, this is, like the internal, Palestinian situation. By the way, today, people my age would understand the history of the Palestinian Authority creation, the Oslo process, pre and post Oslo accords, and how things changed, and and the whole history. We have experienced it. The problem is that you have a new generation, which makes up more than 40% of the Palestinian people, who were born after Oslo, and some of them actually were born after the Second Intifada, which means, like, in the years 2002, 2003, and 4, after defensive shield. This new generation, which is essentially a majority of, if you will, of the Palestinian population, the most active, energetic out there in the streets, the maker or breaker of many things. They are the ones who have not really witnessed anything else other than failures on the political, financial, tracks. Unemployment is high, and so on. I think Israel has lots of interests with the Palestinian Authority, and I think the existence and stability of the Palestinian Authority is not a favor that Israel does to the Palestinians, but essentially is an interest that Israel keeps and works on. And it relates very much to bringing, back a situation where the Palestinian Authority can go back and act in ways that give the younger generation of Palestinians the hopes that we are moving in a process that eventually will take us to a better place. I'm not going, now to actually pose, like political proposal for an Israeli government to consider. I think all of us know what the Palestinians at the end of the day want: a two-state solution as a framework for any engagement between the two sides. You need to treat, I think Israel needs to treat also the Palestinian people as an equal partner. And by the way, this does not and has not to do, and that would be my sort of like advice, if it were to be taken. This is not about pleasing and appeasing, individual Palestinian leaders. I think everything that Israel does needs to be aimed at the Palestinian population and the younger generation, the unemployed, the marginalized, the younger generation who have never had the chance to elect their leadership. Some of these issues are internal. That's very true, domestic Palestinian dynamic. But, the problem is that all of these internal Palestinian dynamics, when they go wrong, they also reflect on Israel. So consideration needs also to be done and taken and given to, all these factors when addressing, the Israeli-Palestinian and specifically the Palestinian, the security situation in the West Bank. One last point on this issue is, the diplomatically known as like confidence building measures. Whether it be Israeli, and I know that in Israel there is lots of resistance or opposition to handing over new territories to the Palestinians in Area C. I know that there are, different positions, right-wing centrists and leftists. But I think when it comes to an objective assessment of a situation, the consideration needs to be, how do we, even if you want to maintain control over 3 million people, you need to actually acknowledge the fact that 40% of those people have not really seen anything other than continued occupation, annexation of territories, de facto annexation of territories, expansion of settlements, and very little consideration to the people, whether it's access and movement at the lowest level or the big political issue, which is national aspirations and end of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So, that's in a big picture. If you want to go into gradual steps, one can talk about gradual steps, that would actually build the bridges of confidence between the two sides.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I'd like to change the focus a little bit and ask you, what role does the Palestinian Authority see for Jordan and Egypt in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? How can Egypt and Jordan help us move closer to a two-state solution?
I think, this is a very good question. And I think, when specifically mentioning Jordan and Egypt, you're touching on the most relevant, countries, and that's a different discussion when people, think of other Arab countries that are remote, who have normalized relations with Israel and how the Palestinian Authority views that. That's a different issue. But when it comes to Jordan and Egypt, those two countries who have already peace treaties with Israel, who have very good relations, I would actually say, with the Palestinian Authority. For now, I think that the Palestinians do not really take any step on the political or diplomatic track without consulting with Jordan and Egypt. Jordan has a stake of interest that is very clear, especially in the West Bank, including Jerusalem and Haram al-Sharif. And I think that the Palestinian Authority relies very heavily on Jordan to address issues, especially that have to do with the Haram al-Sharif problems or friction whenever you have those eruptions. And when it comes to Egypt, I think there is a lot that the Palestinian Authority relies on Egypt delivering. The question is how much those countries would invest. And that, I think, has been, frankly speaking, has been a challenge. How much would those countries invest politically in terms of their contacts with Israel to serve Palestinian interests versus interests of their own? And I think there, I think the issue has been a challenging one, but at the end of the day, both Jordan and Egypt are belongs to the Palestinian Authority. Without them, the Palestinian Authority cannot continue to exist in many ways. Palestinian Authority can do away with less relations with Sudan, but it can't really, I'm just mentioning Sudan as an example, but it can't really do away with relations with Jordan or with Egypt, partly because of the geopolitics of it, but also because of the prominent political role and connections that those countries have with Israel and with the international community at large, whether it's the US and others. I think, to be honest, those two countries can do a lot more to help the Palestinians advance. And in fact, the truth be said, two-state solution is not only, it is primarily a Palestinian interest. It is primarily, in my view, and I think many two-staters also see it that way, an Israeli interest. But it's not exactly, only exclusive to Israeli and Palestinians. The wider region, including Jordan and Egypt, would benefit from it. If you look at the two peace agreements between Jordan and Egypt and the problems of normalization at the public level in both countries, you'll understand that once you have a two-state solution, those countries' interests would also be served better. So, it's all interdependent and it's all connected. And I think, there is a lot I've heard recently during consultations between the Palestinian Authority, Jordan and Egypt. There's a lot of actually advice and consultations, trying to get the Palestinians to not to refrain from doing any political steps that could actually, be problematic, whether it's at the UN or elsewhere, waiting for the outcome of the Israeli elections in November, in the hopes that there would be a new, government and coalition where those two countries would actually jump in and try to bring closer. Of course, that's on the assumption that you have an Israeli coalition that is willing to engage with them on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and advance the two-state solution further.
Thank you so much. Shifting again a little bit, Opinion polls show that the Palestinian public are increasingly moving away from two states as their preferred outcome to the conflict. Instead, they're favoring a single democratic state. Do you believe that this trend is reversible?
I do believe that this trend is reversible. I think that the assumption and the polls are basically gauging Palestinian public frustration with two-state solution, and not really a strategic shift to a one-state solution. I think, the leadership, on the other hand, I mean, when talking about the public, but we also talk about the official position of the Palestinian leadership, I don't really see, the Palestinian leadership moving to a one-state solution as a strategic option. And, there are reasons for this. In fact, if you allow me, I would actually say that there are like three conceptions or understandings of a one-state solution among the Palestinians in general. Stressing the fact that, again, I do believe that polls are gauging Palestinian frustration with two-state solution. So when people are asked about one state versus two states, they actually speak of one state because it is more, because two-state solution is not working. Because you have a whole generation that was born again post-Oslo and has not really seen anything materializing in that direction. The other level, you have Palestinian intellectuals, some, I would say, who actually think that, well, this conflict is not going to be resolved. There are way too many settlers and settlements in the West Bank. Biblical sort of like claim of territories in the West Bank would make it difficult for an Israeli government to give up the territories for a Palestinian state to be created, etc., etc. So they think that a demographic conflict with Israel in a one-state solution would actually give in like one vote, one man, one vote, equal rights kind of state would give Palestinians eventually a majority in the single state, and as such end occupation and foreign control, if you will. And I think, frankly, this is a formula, in my opinion, a formula for an endless conflict with Israel, because I don't really see a situation where Israelis, or the claim of national homeland in this country in terms of Israelis and Jewish people will go away. And I don't really see the Palestinian national identity going away. And as such, if you put the two in one state, you're basically saying, this is a recipe for an endless conflict. That's my own thinking. And this is, I think, some of the intellectuals on the Palestinian side think about it that way. And the third, sort of like school of thinking about the one-state formula is more diplomatic. It's like, we actually tell the Israelis that if you really don't want a two-state solution, then we'll go for one-state solution. So it's a diplomatic threat that was used by Palestinian elites, politicians in the past, and it did not really have a great impact. At the end of the day, I think, again, the only feasible solution, and I think most people realize and understand that, the solution where you end the conflict between the two ethnicities, the Israeli Jewish identity and the Palestinian Arab identity, is by having a a state on the Palestinian side that is a non-threatening state in terms of security, in terms of its existence, is the way to go. Now, how to reach to that point is basically what we are in. I'm one of those, by the way, who have experienced life before Oslo, and despite all the problems that we have and the very gloomy outlook to the future of the conflict and the peaceful resolution of it, I think although progress is made very painfully and very slowly, we moved from a situation pre-Oslo where there was total denial of each other's rights to exist in this territory, in this land, into an acceptable formula, basically both sides accepting the other, but we're fighting over the details of what kind of a state, where it actually starts and where it ends. And I think this episode, as painful as it is, will eventually have to be resolved. I'm a firm believer in this. So the only problem that I would actually caution to in terms of the one-state option is if we go another 10 to 20 years with no solution and no advancement to two-state solution. I'm afraid that people like me will no longer be there, and you will only have a frustrated generation who have lived their entire life on illusions of a two-state solution. And that's why I think there is a strategic need and interest, both in Israel and on the Palestinian side, to push for a solution. If we don't really get into a closed room and negotiators ending an agreement overnight, that's fine. But you need to really start taking steps towards that goal so that the new generations, understand that the course has started and the end result will be a two-state solution. And that's critically important. Otherwise, what is today a fiction and sort of like a fantasy by many younger people who go like, one state, let's go to the beach in Israel, kind of be equal citizens, would actually build it in ways that become an irreversible conviction that the only thing that could work is a one state. And that, I think, on a longer term is a scary, in my opinion, is a scary scenario. Because again, it will take us to an endless conflict.
Got it. Thank you. Somebody in the audience said that it's very difficult to understand you, and some of your audio has gone in and out. So when speaking, try to speak a little closer to the mic, please. And just want to remind everyone in the audience, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. We will be getting to audience Q&A soon. But Ibrahim, you painted a very, scary picture of the future. A two-state solution is absolutely critical, we believe. And I'm wondering if there are any actions that you think that Israel and the Palestinian Authority can take in bolstering the political horizon for two states that could demonstrate to Palestinians that two states remain possible.
Again, please let me know if there are any sort of like sound problems. I'm hearing myself talking, so I can't really tell whether there is a problem. But back to the question. Again, I think if you look at the situation as it stands today, I am one of those who actually don't really think that the opportunity for a two-state solution has been wasted. There are different views about this. Some people think that the construction or the fact that you have as many settlements as you already have in the West Bank has already blocked or killed two-state solution. I really think that what would revive a two-state solution and how I measure, whether we advance towards that goal or not, is not really, how much concrete we have in terms of settlements. I think it is more about the political will and conviction, especially, among the Israeli public, because at the end of the day, there were settlements in Gaza that were taken down. There were settlements in Sinai, or a settlement in Sinai that was taken down. If you have a political will to change things, you can change them, regardless whether you take down settlements in the West Bank or turn them into joint ventures or joint housing or whatever. And the point I think I'm making is this: if we don't grab the opportunity in the next, I would say, 10 years to pick up on a serious process that leads to two-state solution, and I'm choosing my words carefully, understanding the political complications in Israel, among the Palestinians, and everything that you have also in the region and around the globe. And that's why I'm maximizing a period of time, because at the end of the day, the 10 years will pass with or without a two-state solution. The question is whether we go deeper into the conflict or we actually take a step back and start, in the opposite direction, which takes us to peace. There are numerous steps that one could think of, and I'm not sure how much technical you would want me to go, but basically, I'll just throw in an example, which I think is a good example, and an easy, if there was a political will in Israel. You would want to have the Palestinian Authority reciprocate on certain steps that you want from the Palestinian Authority, and understand all the complications with incitement, with other things. On the opposite side, Israel has a lot of things that can offer the Palestinians and engage in a process where it becomes reciprocal. So the Palestinian Authority would take one step in a direction, the Israelis would take another step in another direction. For instance, we have 42% of the West Bank an area classified as Area B, meaning that the Palestinian Authority has access to this area or only in specific terms of zoning, planning, restricted by Israel, but essentially they have like the authority to manage all civil affairs in those territories. Those areas can actually be simply turned into areas, into Area A, where the Palestinian Authority can control them in full, like they do in Area A. And I'm leaving, aside the security aspect of it, because if you have solid security coordination, you can actually solve problems that have to do with security. And again, we will start talking about the crisis of security coordination, but I think in the outlook ahead, there is no alternative to strengthening the security coordination and rebuilding that in ways that would permit Israel to actually give up some of its authorities on Palestinian territory. We're talking about Palestinian population centers, that there are no settlements there, there are no bypass roads there, there are no Israeli interests inside or on those territories. And therefore, transferring those to the Palestinian Authority would be seen as a major and huge step in Palestinian eyes, an advancement towards, a political resolution of the conflict, a mini step. Don't get me wrong, because that does not end the conflict. But you start a process with steps like these that do not, harm Israeli interests and do not give away territories right at the beginning of a process, but it actually advances the process. That's essentially, these are the kind of issues, and there are so many other issues like that one can actually put out. I think, frankly, the upcoming Israeli elections are important, and I think that the Israeli public, as is the case, would produce a government and a coalition, and the hopes are that there will be centrist Israeli politicians, depending also on security establishment assessment of the situation, that would push this stalemate with the Palestinian Authority on a path that leads eventually to peace. And if you notice, I'm not a dreamer in the sense of saying we need to sit down and negotiate this conflict and finish it in one night or 1 week. I understand that this is not plausible, but what is plausible and what can be done is start a gradual process of de-occupation, a process that leads to eventually to an agreement, rather than continue to be sucked deeper into the circles of violence, going to the bleak sort of like situation where people here give up on two-state solution and go into a more, in my opinion, problematic approach, which is demanding a one-state equal rights kind of solution.
Thank you very much. Shifting gears again, and you begun to allude to this earlier, but I want to ask it. The Palestinian public overwhelmingly opposes the Abraham Accords, viewing it as a rejection of the Palestinian cause. Do you believe the normalization with those countries signed on to the Abraham Accords can actually be leveraged to benefit the Palestinians, bolster Israeli-Palestinian ties, and promote progress on the conflict?
I think there is a misunderstanding and a misconception, basically, of the Palestinian position on Abraham Accords, pursuit of a state of their own. The Abraham Accords came basically to do two things from a Palestinian perspective. One is to do away with the Arab Peace Initiative, which gave them leverage over, the process of negotiation to offer Israel, basically a package of normalization with Arab and Islamic countries in exchange for ending the occupation. And that circumvents the whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict into direct relations and normalization of relations between Israel and the Arab countries. What the Palestinians had hoped for with the leverage that they had, which is the Arab Peace Initiative, is to go to a two-state solution, and then Israel would actually, have normal relations not only with the Palestinian state, but also with the Arab states in the region and even Islamic countries. Now, that I think is behind us today, because obviously the Abraham Accords initially was opposed by the Palestinians, but by the way, that was only when the Arab Emirates, the United Arab Emirates signed the accords. But after that, the Palestinians had a passive position, and they did not oppose any of the agreements that were actually signed later, meaning with Sudan or with Morocco. So they changed, their attitude and their behavior, if you will, although they did not change their position of basically saying the Abraham Accords do not serve Palestinian interests. With that in mind, I think that it's not up to the Palestinians; it's basically up to Israel and the parties to the Abraham Accords, the Arab countries who signed on them, or those who wish to actually become signatories to those accords, is whether to include the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the set of Palestinian interests in the Abraham Accords. Without it, even if the Palestinians do support it, it's meaningless because it does not address any of their issues, whether at the political or economic level. So I think, the question of the Abraham Accords for the Palestinians and Palestinian engagement is hypothetical, and if it were to be addressed in a serious way, it needs to be reconsidered or amended or restructured to address the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Palestinian interests in it. Without that, you can't really think or expect that the Palestinians would support something that has nothing in it for them. And that, I think, is essentially, the Palestinian position. But saying that, and by the way, this is not only the position of the Palestinian leadership, I think applaud, even if you have a different Palestinian leadership in future years or in coming years, they would have the same thing. Like, you want me to be part of the Abraham Accords, what's in it, in it for me? It's as simple as that. Now, some people actually accuse the Palestinians of basically saying you're anti-normalization between Israel and Arab countries, which I think is unfair, because the Palestinian position and the Arab Peace Initiative, the way it was structured and phrased and sequenced, is that this would be the prize that Israel, this is the leverage that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has once resolved to Israel. And in many practical ways, if we were to think realpolitik here, you would actually have to acknowledge that if Israel gets normalization without solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, then why should they? Why should they actually solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict? It just takes more efforts, whether intellectually or politically, to actually argue for a two-state solution at the end of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict while you have normal relations with all Arab countries. But with that said, I would actually highlight the fact that you have two countries, the two major countries who had wars with Israel, Jordan and Egypt. And despite the fact that they have peace treaties, not just accords, because the Abraham Accords are not peace accords in the full sense. When you have peace treaties between Jordan, Israel, and Egypt, Israel, you still have disillusioned, disoriented publics both in Jordan and in Egypt, who would, in reality, in fact, once and if you have a regional solution, basically, an end of the Israeli conflict, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and then you widen it to the region, then not only political regimes, but also people would actually feel, the benefits of it, and as such be automatic supporters of it. If not all of them, then the majority of them. So that's, I think, where this whole question of Arab Accords and how it fits in terms of Palestinian policy or political position. This is how it's seen. And again, as I said, like, the Palestinians reacted first emotionally and angrily to the Abraham Accord signing, but then after that they basically took several steps back, and they just took a passive position, which is what we will not engage in something that it does not really relate to us.
Great, thank you so much. This is the last question that I have prepared, and then we'll turn to some questions from the audience. So if anyone has additional questions who's tuning in with us, now is your time to please put them in the chat. So my last question is, do you believe that there is an appetite among Palestinians for engagement with Israel, so long as it does not come at the expense of a political resolution to the conflict?
Can you please repeat the question?
Sure. Do you believe there is an appetite among Palestinians for engagement with Israel, so long as it does not come at the expense of a political resolution to the conflict?
I think, people who actually live here, and now I'm talking about the Palestinian people, we have more than 200 to 300,000, depending on what point in time you take the statistics, who actually work in Israel. And that's, I think, engagement. You have people who actually go and take medical treatment in Israel, and that's actually engagement. You have shoppers and business sector, private sector who actually engage with Israeli private sector. We have startups, high tech, and other initiatives who actually engage with Israel. I don't really think that the Palestinian people at large have a problem of engagement with Israel. The problem is that people are, like Israelis, people are exposed to certain parts of the Israeli society. Many people in the West Bank only know Israelis who are soldiers and or settlers. Israelis, on the other hand, know many Palestinians who are either cheap laborers, unskilled laborers, or terrorist attackers. But the two societies in sort of like the core components and segments of the two societies have not really engaged in real ways because of the conflict. But at the end, I think that it is a matter of time. Once you remove the political problems or problem and conflict, the question of integration and working with Israelis, I don't really imagine when we talk about the Palestinian state, I don't really think any Palestinian imagines a Palestinian state that is isolated from Israel. Sorry, I'm not talking about federation and confederation kind of connections. I'm talking about day-to-day activities, life and all kind of activities that would have to be integrated. That the Palestinian state cannot really flourish and exist without engagement with Israel at so many different levels. Now, in the meantime, you have two kinds, as I said, like you have so many positive sort of like engagements between Palestinians and Israelis at different levels, and you have so many negative, byproducts, if you will, of the conflict and neither of these can actually be overgeneralized to say that's the Israeli-Palestinian relation. By the way, it's very difficult to actually say, look, the Palestinians and Israelis are fighting all day long because, again, there are so many people on both sides who actually engage on a daily basis in different ways. But you can't generalize that and say, look, the Palestinians and Israelis are living in peace, because you do have, although other signs and problems and symptoms of the conflict that continue to actually take place. So, I'm not sure whether this answers the question amply, but I think that, thinking of engagement without resolving the conflict is wrong. And it's very much like saying that, the other way around can be overgeneralized. So I think, by virtue of living together, the geopolitics of it, we're living in the same home. There are so many, you go to area B, which I mentioned earlier, and you see so many, like workshops, grocery stores, and others where settlers, even settlers in the West Bank, use certain bypass roads. And you know how problematic the settler-Palestinian relations in the West Bank are. But you will find people who actually have, signs on their workshops in Hebrew trying to attract customers, Israeli customers. Now, does this actually mean that settlers and Palestinians coexist in the West Bank peacefully? That's an overgeneralization. That's, you need to have a political solution where you actually regulate all these things, taking Israeli and Palestinian interest into account. And then you have a frame where, yes, this kind of engagement then will be, generalized. That's how I think it should be looked at.
Great. Thank you so much, Ibrahim. So there have been a number of questions in the chat that people have submitted. So I want to move us on to our Q&A portion. As a reminder, if you have any last questions, please put them in the chat and we'll do our best to get to them. The first question I want to ask you is as follows. Recognizing that Fatah may not follow the law, how is the legal succession process supposed to work in the event that Abbas dies? And are there younger Fatah members between 40 and 50 who could be a viable presidential candidate?
Thank you. This is a very important question that I think everyone thinks of. And the question is twofold. One is that if you leave it to only internal Palestinian dynamics, I think the preference of the top leadership of Fatah is to basically take over leadership, divide it among senior, officials. So you will have more than one official in charge of more than one portfolio. And by the way, Abu Mazen has like 3 positions, not only one. So there is a room for division, if you will, on the theoretical level. But I think that there will be a difficult interim period, transitional period, that does not really fix the problem. If you look at the situation post Abu Mazen as rebuilding Fatah control in the West Bank with a single person and leaving, the Gaza Strip under Hamas's control, then I think you're talking about an easy situation where collectively, Fatah, Central Committee leaders would collectively assume control, rotate some of those positions, and move forward without having to resolve it. And those are like all very, very old people. The youngest of them is like hitting 65. Now, if you think about the younger generation and Fatah cadres, yes, there are so many people, there is so much talent. The problem is that we don't have, regular democratic elections. We had elections only 3 times, the last of which was in 2006. And I think, and I'm, want to carefully word this. I think that the international community and Israel at large need not to just take a neutral position on this. They need to encourage the Palestinian leadership to open up for elections, to an open elections. And by the way, there are those who actually say that elections will automatically lead to a Hamas control of the West Bank. And I don't really think that this is true. I think there is a lot of room if there were, and stress on this, if there were free and open elections. Many people who were preparing to run in elections last year from Fatah were dismissed, and many of them were actually fired, and many of them were even sent abroad or had to be. And that is because there is no opportunity for them to, or there was no opportunity, and there was like lots of intimidation and many other tactics that were used to prevent them from running in these elections, which were eventually canceled. If we have regular elections, and that's encouraged by the international community, not only as a Palestinian desire, there is enough Palestinian desire to do that, but at the end of the day, there needs to be a collective approach to it, and legitimacy would only be given to elected officials. I think at that point, we'll start to see changes. Those who like to think that Hamas will always win, I think overlook the fact that for the past 17 years in ruling Gaza, people in Gaza have so many grievances and complaints about Hamas's rule. And therefore, if you test them in elections, I don't really think that they will have the same situation as they did before. The more openness you have within Fatah to actually, for new leaders to actually come out, you will actually have them and see them. And I wouldn't really worry much about the foundations of a political process and security process with Israel, because the political differences between the Fatah leaders are not really about which political line we need to pursue with Israel. They are more about internal power strife than they are about the conflict with Israel. I mean, this is a very thorny topic that requires a lot more than 2 minutes answer. But I think, yes, basically, we just need to have elections promoted internally, and I think there are enough number of people here who would actually promote and call and push for elections. But we also need external help and support, and almost, I would even dare to say, conditioning legitimacy of any authority on being elected.
Thank you so much. Recognizing that we don't have that much time left, I'm going to try to combine both of our last questions into one. A quick follow-up question relating to what you just said. Do you think there's any role that America could play in helping with the process to elect a new Palestinian leader after Mahmoud Abbas? And the final question, I hope you can address both of these quickly, is what are the most immediate challenges to Israeli-Palestinian security coordination? And are there any practical steps that the U.S. can undertake to fortify the relationship?
Okay, on the first question, I think the answer is simply yes. I don't want to recall, but basically there were times where the U.S. administration, about 20 years ago, if you will, took a very firm position demanding elections and reform on the Palestinian side, and basically saying that we will not deal with any leadership that is not elected. That was followed even by Europeans, and basically, it got the Palestinians to be in a situation where they have also internal powers that push for elections, and in fact, even tradition that pushes for elections. Remember that Yasser Arafat, when he signed Oslo, the first thing that he did was basically holding elections. So he didn't enter into the West Bank and assume presidency, West Bank and Gaza, and assume presidency on the fact that he was the PLO leader. He actually had to go through elections. So that set a tradition. When he passed away, you had Abu Mazen doing the same. And we also had the PLC elections in 2006. So we already have the tradition. The question is whether you have a political will. Obviously, when you have leaders who can do without elections, they'll just do it. If you will, power corrupts. So with that note, I would say yes, the US, the international community at large and regional power who are interested enough and have interests and stakes with the Palestinian democracy need to be a moving force towards that, and it's doable. It's not an impossible or mission impossible. The other question about security coordination and challenges of what the US has been doing, frankly, I think that the US has done a lot in the past 15 years, and I was, like myself, an employee of the US government, the consulate before it was closed, and I saw firsthand the creation of the United States Security Coordination Mission, which actually leads about 14 and now maybe 8 other countries in training and providing logistics and institutional advice to the Palestinian security forces, and that was critical and essential in rebuilding the Palestinian security forces and coordination with Israel after 2005. And I think continuing with that role is of key importance. By the way, the Palestinians look at the role, and I know that this may sound bad to some right-wing Israeli politicians, but that's the reality. Many Palestinians look at the USSC mission and other countries' security role, even if advisory, as a prelude to what could actually happen, even when you talk about final status, permanent status, negotiations and solution, where you could also deploy third-party countries to actually help in security arrangements, even if at transitional basis. So that's an important element, and I think that the US leads that effort. And I think what I'm hearing from different sources is that this mission continues, and actually it's supported by the US administrations, whether Republicans or Democrats, because they understand how profound and how important it is. Same way also with the Israeli, with their army or other security branches who understand, appreciate, and cooperate with this force. So yes, the US can do a lot, and they have been doing a lot. But again, as I mentioned earlier, we have a crisis now that relates to many internal Palestinian problems, also political stalemate, also difficult economic situation. But in my opinion, these are resolvable issues if you have the right policies in place.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ibrahim, for taking the time to speak with our group today. And
Thank
thank you
you
to all of our community members for their insightful questions. I'll now turn it over to IPF Atid Program Associate Max Webb for some announcements.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jason, for moderating an amazing session. And thank you, Ibrahim, for speaking. It was really fascinating. You're so insightful on these issues.
Thank you.
This concludes a wonderful 3-part series over the past month or so on our Critical Neighbors platform. I wanted to give a special thank you to everyone who attended and to the people who helped make this possible, particularly our previous speakers, Farah Badur, Hesham Youssef, and of course, our very own Nimrod Novik. Also to the IPF Atid team and to the Israel Policy Forum staff at large for playing such a big role in all of this. We have a lot of exciting events coming up in the next few weeks around the holidays. So there's a lot to look forward to from IPF Atid and Israel Policy Forum. Tomorrow, if you're in DC, there's an in-person young professional opportunity for you. And if you are in any other city, we have a virtual option. We are having an event on Palestinian economics. It's actually a part of a series exploring Palestinian economics. So this will be Palestinian Economics 101, the fundamentals. You can find the link for both the in-person and virtual options in the chat. We are also having an Israel Policy Forum briefing on recent violence and tension in the West Bank. That's on Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern time. And then Thursday evening in New York City, we are having an event with JCC where we're hosting Ksenia Svetlova, former member of Knesset, at the JCC. Finally, in Chicago, on October 7th, we have the second event in our Shabbat series discussing visions of Zionism with Anshe Shalom Synagogue. And then finally, if you do not follow us on social media yet, there is a link in the chat to follow us on social media, to subscribe to our emails. This is the best way to stay up to date with everything that is happening with IPF Atid. Thank you all again so much for participating, to Jason and Ibrahim, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.